The worst moment of my life didn't happen when I found my son sitting on the floor of his own apartment, shaking like a man who had just survived a car crash. It happened 10 seconds before that, when his college friend grabbed my arm in the hallway and said, in the quietest voice I had ever heard, "Before you go in there, there's something you need to know about her." I was 63 years old that morning. I had buried my wife 2 years prior. I had survived a heart procedure, a layoff at 58, and the particular loneliness that comes from watching your children grow into people who no longer need you the way they once did. I thought I had seen most of what life could throw at a man. I thought I was past the age of being truly surprised. I was wrong. Let me take you back to where this really started, because the story doesn't begin in that hallway. It begins 18 months earlier, on a Sunday afternoon in October, when my son first brought her home to meet me. My son was 31 at the time. He had moved to Columbus for work, about 2 hours from the house where I'd raised him, and we had settled into a comfortable rhythm of phone calls on Sundays and visits every couple of months. He was an electrical engineer, steady and quiet like his mother had been, the kind of man who thought carefully before he spoke and meant every word he said. I had always been proud of him, not in a loud way, just in the way that settles into your chest when you look at someone and realize you did something right. He called me on a Thursday night, which was unusual. He said he had met someone. He said it was serious. He said he wanted me to meet her before things went any further, because my opinion mattered to him. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone, looking out the window at the empty backyard, and feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, maybe, or something close to it. She arrived with my son that Sunday in a car I didn't recognize, a white SUV that still had the temporary paper plates in the back window. She was 32, a few months older than my son, with dark eyes and a quick smile, and the kind of confidence that fills a room before you've had a chance to decide what you think of it. She worked in pharmaceutical sales. She had grown up in Atlanta. She talked easily, laughed often, and spent most of dinner asking me questions about my career, my late wife, the town I grew up in. I told myself I liked her. But there was something, some small thing I couldn't name and didn't try very hard to name, a quality to her attention that felt slightly off. The way a painting can look right from across the room, but something about the brushwork bothers you when you stand close. I couldn't point to a single thing she said or did. I just felt it. My son asked me afterward what I thought, and I said she seemed lovely, because she did seem lovely, and because I knew, even then, that what I was feeling had less to do with her than with me. I had been alone for 2 years. I had been the only important person in my son's life for 2 years, or at least that's the story I had told myself. A new woman in his life meant a rearrangement of things. I knew that. I factored that in. I told myself I was being fair. They were engaged 8 months later. My son called me on a Thursday again, same day of the week, as if he needed the distance of a work night to make the big announcements. He sounded happy, genuinely happy, the way he used to sound when he was 12 and had just gotten the highest score in his class on a science test. I said all the right things. I meant most of them. The wedding was small, 30 people in a garden outside Columbus on a warm Saturday in June. My son's college friend was the best man, a big, cheerful man who had known my son since freshman orientation and who gave a toast that made half the room cry. My sister drove up from Cincinnati and sat beside me in the second row. I watched my son say his vows, with his voice steady and his eyes full, and I thought, whatever I feel about this, whatever small, unnameable thing I carry about this woman, none of it matters. He loves her. That's enough. I drove home that evening telling myself it was enough. For the first year of their marriage, things seemed fine. I visited Columbus 4 or 5 times, always calling ahead, always staying no more than 2 nights. She was a good hostess. The apartment was clean and well furnished, nicer than I expected on 2 incomes where one traveled frequently for work. My son seemed happy, tired sometimes, I thought, and occasionally quieter than usual, but happy in the essential way. When I asked him how things were, he said good. He always said good. It was my sister who first said something out loud. She had come to Columbus with me in February, 8 months into the marriage, for my son's birthday. We took them to dinner at a place my son liked, a steakhouse downtown, and my sister sat across from my son's wife and watched her the way she had always watched people, With that particular stillness, she had developed over 65 years of being the smartest person in most rooms she entered. On the drive home, 2 hours south in the dark, she said, "That woman counts every word your son says before she decides whether to agree with it." I told her she was reading too much into things. She said, "Maybe," but she said it in the tone that meant, "I don't think so." I pushed it aside. I pushed it aside for 3 more months until my son called me on a Wednesday night, which had never happened before, and asked me if I still had the contact information for the attorney who had handled his mother's estate. I asked him why. He said he just needed to ask about something, some paperwork, nothing serious. His voice was careful in the way that voices get when someone is trying very hard to sound casual. I gave him the number. I didn't sleep well that night. 2 weeks later he called again, Sunday, the usual time. He sounded normal. He said things were good. He did not mention the attorney. I did not ask. A month after that, I got a call from his college friend. We had exchanged numbers at the wedding, the way people do, with the vague intention of staying in touch that rarely amounts to anything. So when his name appeared on my phone on a Tuesday afternoon in May, I assumed he was calling about something to do with my son's upcoming birthday, maybe organizing something, maybe asking for advice about a gift. "I don't really know how to say this," he began, "so I'm just going to say it. I think something is wrong with my friend, and I think it has to do with his wife." I sat down. He told me he had seen my son 3 weeks earlier, a Wednesday lunch, just the two of them, at a place near my son's office. He said my son had lost weight. He said my son seemed nervous in a way that was hard to describe, checking his phone every few minutes, choosing his words carefully, even in private conversation. He said at one point my son had started to say something and then stopped himself and looked away and changed the subject entirely. He said he had known my son for 10 years and had never seen him look the way he looked at that lunch. He looked like a man who had done something wrong, his friend told me, except I don't think it's him who's done anything wrong. I asked him what he meant. He said he didn't know specifically. He said he was calling me because he didn't know what else to do, and because I was my son's father, and because he trusted me to handle it carefully. I thanked him. I hung up. I sat in my kitchen for a long time, looking out the window at the backyard. Then I called my son and asked if I could come visit the following weekend. I said I just wanted to see him. I said I had some things I wanted to drop off, some of his mother's things I'd finally gotten around to sorting through. He said, of course. He sounded pleased. He sounded, for a moment, like himself. I drove up that Friday, arriving around 4 in the afternoon. My son buzzed me into the building and met me at the elevator, and the moment I saw him in the hallway, I understood what his friend had meant on the phone. He had lost weight. Yes, maybe 15 pounds, maybe more. And there was a quality to his posture I had never seen before. A slight forward curve to his shoulders, as if he were perpetually bracing for something. He hugged me. He held on a beat longer than usual. We spent Friday evening eating takeout and watching a baseball game, and his wife was friendly and easy, and just slightly too attentive to my son's words, just slightly too quick to finish his sentences when he paused. I sat on their couch and felt the thing I had felt at that first Sunday dinner, that small, unnameable wrongness, except it was larger now and had a shape I still couldn't quite make out. Saturday morning, his wife left early for work. She was covering a territory in Dayton that weekend, she said. She kissed my son on the cheek at the door and told him not to let me leave without saying goodbye. I watched my son watch her go. When the door closed, he stood in the kitchen for a moment with his back to me, and then he turned around, and I saw his face, and I said, "Tell me." He didn't answer right away. He poured himself a second cup of coffee he didn't drink and sat down across from me and looked at the table. And then he said, "I think I made a mistake, Dad." What came out over the next 2 hours was not a simple story, and I won't pretend it was. It came in pieces, out of order, with long pauses and several points where he stopped and looked at the window and seemed to be deciding whether to continue. But the shape of it, the essential shape of it, was this. 6 months into the marriage, his wife had suggested they consolidate their finances. A joint account, shared access, streamlined bills, practical and sensible. My son had agreed. He was an engineer. He liked efficiency. He liked things being clear. Within 3 months, he began to notice small inconsistencies in their bank statements. Withdrawals he didn't recognize, amounts that didn't match the receipts he found when he went looking. When he asked about them, his wife always had an explanation. A work expense she'd forgotten to mention, a subscription she'd canceled but hadn't processed yet, a transfer to her elderly mother's account that she'd meant to tell him about. The explanations were always reasonable. They were always slightly different from what he'd expected, and they always came with a look, a particular quiet look she gave him that made him feel as though he had asked something inappropriate. She made me feel like I was being paranoid, he told me, like I was being controlling. Every time I brought something up, by the end of the conversation, I was apologizing. Over the 18 months of their marriage, my son had tracked the inconsistencies in a notebook he kept in his office at work, the one place he was confident she didn't go. The amounts were not large in isolation. 200 here, 400 there, a few larger transfers that had explanations which technically checked out if you didn't look too closely. But added together, across 18 months, the figure he had arrived at was somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000. $40,000 to $50,000. I sat with that number for a long moment. Have you talked to anyone? I asked. A lawyer? A financial advisor? He said he had called the attorney once, the one I'd given him the number for. He said he'd gotten as far as making an appointment and then canceled it the night before because his wife had found out somehow, he didn't know how, and had been so hurt, so genuinely wounded by what she called his distrust, that he had convinced himself he was wrong, that he had misread the numbers, that the man who had raised him to be careful with money had passed him some faulty anxiety that was now destroying his marriage. She's very good, he said quietly, at making me feel like the problem is me. I drove home Sunday evening with a weight in my chest that I had not carried since the week my wife was diagnosed. I called my sister from the car. I told her what he'd told me. There was a silence on the line, and then she said, I knew. Not triumphantly, just quietly. The way you say something when you wish with everything in you that you had been wrong. I spent the next 3 weeks doing something I had never done in my life. I investigated. I am not a detective. I am a retired civil engineer from a mid-sized city in Ohio. But I am a man who spent 40 years reading technical documents and finding the one number in 500 that didn't belong, and some skills transfer. I called the attorney myself and explained the situation. He walked me through what to look for and suggested I talk to a forensic accountant, a woman whose name he gave me, who did this kind of work regularly. I called her the next day. She asked me for whatever documentation my son could get her access to without tipping his wife off. I called my son and told him what I was doing. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, okay, just that. One word that held about 30 different things inside it. Over the next 10 days, my son quietly photographed 3 months of bank records, credit card statements, and a series of transfers he had found in a separate account he hadn't known existed until the accountant told him what to look for. He emailed them to her from his work account on a Thursday afternoon. She called me on a Monday morning. The number wasn't 40 to 50,000. It was closer to 90. But that wasn't the part that made me sit down and put my hand over my mouth. The part that did that was what she had found in the separate account, the account that had been opened in both their names, which meant my son was technically a co-holder, but which he had never been told about and had never signed anything to authorize. Into that account, over the past 14 months, had flowed a series of transfers from another account, an account that was not his wife's salary, an account that traced back, after 2 more days of careful work by the forensic accountant, to a man in Atlanta whose name my son recognized, her former boyfriend, a man she had told my son she hadn't spoken to in years. The transfers weren't romantic. They were financial. The accountant couldn't tell me exactly what the arrangement was, only that money had been moving from that man in Atlanta into an account technically in my son's name, and from there, in smaller amounts, back out again in ways that were going to require a lawyer to properly understand. But the shape of it was not a shape that had innocent explanations. I called the attorney back that afternoon. 2 weeks later, my son had quietly moved most of his personal documents to his office. He had opened a new bank account in his name alone. He had spoken to the attorney, who had spelled out his options and the likely timeline of each one. And he had decided, after several long and agonizing phone calls with me and one long call with his college friend, that he was going to confront his wife. He asked me to come. I drove up on a Thursday evening, planning to arrive by 7. His wife knew I was coming. My son had told her I was stopping by on my way to a weekend in Cleveland, which was plausible enough that she hadn't questioned it. His friend was also going to be there. My son had asked him to come, and he had said yes without any hesitation. I parked in the lot at 6:50 and took the elevator up. I was walking down the hallway toward their apartment door with a bag in my hand and a speech I had rehearsed in the car for 2 hours, when the door to the apartment across the hall opened and my son's friend stepped out. He had been waiting. He had gotten there first, and he had been waiting in the hallway because he needed to tell me something before I went in. "She's not there," he said. "She left this afternoon. My friend came home from work, and she was gone. Most of her things, and he's in there alone, and he's not doing well." I set the bag down on the floor of the hallway. "How long ago?" "He called me about an hour ago. He's okay. He's not hurt. But she left a letter." I went in. My son was sitting on the floor of the living room with his back against the couch and his knees up and his hands loose in his lap. Not crying. Past crying. Maybe. Or not there yet. In some dry, quiet place between the two. The apartment was the same as it had always been, except that certain things were gone. A lamp from the corner. Artwork from 2 walls. The small, decorative things that had always been hers. And the absence of them made the room feel like a stage after the actors have left. I sat down on the floor next to him. I didn't say anything for a while. He didn't either. After a few minutes, he handed me the letter. It was 1 page, handwritten, in a script I recognized from birthday cards she had signed over the past 2 years. It said she was sorry. It said she had never meant to hurt him. It said she had been in a difficult financial situation when they met, one she had been ashamed to tell him about, and that she had made choices she now regretted. It said she hoped someday he would understand that she had cared about him, even if her actions hadn't shown it. It said she was going somewhere she could figure things out. It did not mention the man in Atlanta. It did not mention the $90,000. It did not mention the account in my son's name that a lawyer was now going to have to spend considerable time untangling. I folded the letter and set it on the coffee table and looked at my son and thought about all the things I could say. I thought about, "I told you so," which was true, but monstrous. I thought about "it's going to be okay," which might be true, but wasn't something either of us could know yet. I thought about how my wife would have handled this, what she would have said, and I felt the absence of her so sharply in that moment that it was almost physical. What I said was, "I should have done this sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." He looked at me. "I felt something from the beginning," I said. "I didn't trust it. I thought it was about me, about not wanting to share you, about grief making me selfish. And some of it was that, but some of it wasn't, and I should have looked harder sooner. I'm sorry." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I felt it too." We sat on the floor of his emptied living room for a long time that night. The 3 of us, my son and his friend and me, ordering food that none of us ate very much of, talking about the practical things and then, eventually, the less practical things. His friend had brought a bottle of whiskey, which seemed right. My son had the attorney's number in his phone and an appointment on Monday. The forensic accountant had documented everything in a format that would hold up. The legal process that followed was not quick. I will not pretend it was, because that would be dishonest, and it would disrespect my son's experience of it. It took 14 months. It involved an attorney and a forensic accountant, and, eventually, a civil filing that froze the disputed account and forced the question of where the money had come from into a formal proceeding. My son's wife, through her own attorney, contested everything initially. Then, about 4 months in, she didn't. The arrangement with the man in Atlanta turned out to be what the attorney called a structured misdirection, a polite legal term for something that was not polite at all. She had been receiving funds from him and cycling them through the joint account in a way that obscured their origin, while simultaneously drawing down my son's earnings in increments small enough not to trigger automatic alerts. The man in Atlanta was not a former boyfriend. He was a former employer, A man whose business was under federal investigation for a variety of reasons that had nothing to do with my son and everything to do with why he needed clean-looking accounts to move money through. My son had been used. His name, his credit, his clean financial record, that was what she had needed when she married him. The attorney was careful to explain this to my son in the most clinical language possible, and I was grateful for that, because clinical language creates distance, and distance was what my son needed to hear, that particular truth. She received a settlement agreement that required her to repay $62,000 over 5 years and cooperate with the federal investigation into the Atlanta operation. My son received the remainder of his accounts, clear title to the apartment, and a divorce finalized in November of last year. He did not receive the 18 months of his life he had spent in that marriage, or the weight he had lost, or the particular quality of trust that, once broken in that specific way, takes a long time to come back. But he received other things. He called me more, not just Sundays, Wednesdays, sometimes, Thursdays, the occasional Saturday morning when he was out running and just wanted to talk. We drove to 3 baseball games together the summer after the divorce, 2 in Columbus and 1 in Cleveland, and I watched him slowly unfold back into himself in the way that a plant grows back toward light, gradually and without drama, and almost imperceptibly, until one day you look and it's turned all the way around. His college friend, who had made that phone call I almost hadn't known what to do with, became a regular presence in my life as well. He drove down to my house twice that first winter. No particular occasion, just to have dinner and watch football and be in the same room as the 2 people who knew the full story. I was grateful for him in a way I had trouble saying out loud, so I said it the way older men say such things, by cooking the meals he liked and never missing his calls and showing up when he needed someone to show up. And my sister, who had sat in the passenger seat of my car 2 years earlier and said that woman counts every word your son says. I called her more too. I told her she had been right. She said she wished she hadn't been. Then she said, "You were right too, though, about why you felt it." It was both things at once. I think that's one of the truest things anyone has ever said to me about how grief and instinct and love all tangle together when you're not paying careful enough attention. I am 64 now. I live in the same house I have lived in for 30 years, the one my wife and I bought when my son was 2, the one with the backyard I look out at from the kitchen window. The backyard is better than it used to be because last spring my son came down for a weekend and we put in a garden together, nothing elaborate, tomatoes and a few rows of something else he wanted to try. And we worked all of Saturday with the radio on and talked about nothing important and everything important in the way that you only can when your hands are busy and neither of you has to look directly at the other. He is doing well. He is genuinely doing well. Not in the careful way he used to say good when I asked how things were, but in the way that you can hear through the phone and verify with your own eyes when you see him. He is himself again, maybe more than he was before, with the particular solidity that some people develop after they have survived something they didn't expect to survive. I think about what I would tell a man in my position at the moment I was sitting in my kitchen after that call from my son's friend, with a low feeling I couldn't name and an instinct I didn't know what to do with. I would tell him this: the feeling is information. Not the whole truth, not permission to act without evidence, but information. Don't dismiss it because you love someone and want to be fair to them. Don't dismiss it because you've cataloged your own flaws and decided the feeling is just one of them. Your gut is not infallible, but it is not nothing. I would also tell him what I told my son on the floor of that apartment, which is the thing I most needed to hear myself and most needed to say out loud. I should have looked sooner. That's not self-punishment. It's just a fact that needed to be spoken between us, so that neither of us would carry it alone. My son didn't fail because he trusted her. He trusted her because he was raised to take people at their word, and that is not a flaw. The failure was in the places where I could have helped him see more clearly and chose instead to manage my own discomfort. That is the part that took me the longest to set down. Not the anger was clean, and it burned through, and it left. It was the version of events where I had done things differently that I kept returning to. The version where I spoke up earlier, where I called the attorney 6 months sooner, where I trusted my sister's stillness in that steakhouse in February and asked the questions I was afraid to ask. I had to let that version go eventually. You have to let it go, or it becomes the story you live in instead of the one you move forward from. My son came down 2 weekends ago. He stayed 3 nights, which is the longest he has stayed since his mother died. We planted the last of the fall garden on the 2nd day, working in the cool October air while the dog from 2 doors down sat at the fence and watched us hopefully. My son told me he had been on a few dates, nothing serious, nothing he wanted to make too much of yet. He said it carefully, the way he says the important things, and I said good, and I meant it completely. That evening we sat on the back porch after dinner and watched the sun go down behind the neighbor's tree, and after a while my son said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" I asked what. That his friend was standing in the hallway, he said. What if he hadn't been? What if he'd been 5 minutes later and you'd already gone in? I sat with that for a moment. Then we would have figured it out anyway, I said. It would have taken longer, but we would have. He nodded slowly. He thought about that. Yeah, he said. I think that's probably right. The sun finished going down. The dog gave up on us and wandered away from the fence. We went inside and washed the dishes and watched the end of a game neither of us particularly cared about. And the house was quiet in the good way, the way it had not been quiet in a long time, the way that means the people who are supposed to be in it are exactly where they are. That is the whole of it, or as much of it as I know how to put into words. I am not a man who talks easily about the things that matter most to him. I had to learn, a little late, and at some cost, that not talking is not the same as protecting. I had to learn that love is not just warmth and presence, it is also the hard phone call, the second question, the willingness to sit on a floor in an emptied apartment and say out loud the thing that most needs saying. I think my wife knew that. I think she always knew it. And I think she tried to teach it to me in the small ways that she had, and I think I learned it finally in the way that some lessons only come through the things you cannot take back. If you've gone through something like this, or if you're sitting right now with a feeling you haven't been able to name, I want you to know you are not wrong for having it. Look carefully, ask the question, make the call, do it sooner than I did. That's the most important thing I have to say.